All right. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. I'm honored to just kind of introduce everybody to Michelle and Cindy. Hopefully, everybody's seen Michelle's solo show at Keystone. If you haven't, Michelle's going to have a slideshow for us and share the work. And there's still time to see it in person. So I'm honored to be able to be here to support Michelle. I'm Christine, and I run Shoebox Arts. And with that, I wanted to just give a brief bio of Michelle and Cindy so you know who they are, what they do, what they've done, and where their experience in their conversation is coming from. So Michelle received her bachelor's in environmental design in 1991 from Texas A&M University and continued with graduate studies at Texas A&M's program in visualization. During that time, she produced animated short films that were shown at the Walker Art Center, the Dallas Museum of Art, Imagina in Monaco, and the AFI National Video Festival. She's been an artist with the Walt Disney Animation Studios for 28 years, with credits that include Frozen and Zootopia. And she's currently head of characters on the forthcoming release Encanto. She also maintains an active personal studio practice and completed her MFA in visual arts at the New Hampshire Institute of Art in 2019. She's been published in Sci Art magazine and Precog magazine and exhibited her work at the New York Hall of Science, the Coastline Gallery, Chaffee Museum in California, the Dairy Center for the Arts in Colorado, and Celia Coker Gallery at Coker University in South Carolina. She also recently juried a digital art exhibition and film festival for the San Luis Obispo Museum of Art in California. So Cindy Rehm is a Los Angeles-based artist and educator. She serves as co-facilitator for the Sisu Reading Group and is co-founder of the feminist-centered projects Craftswoman House and Feminist Love Letters. Rheem's interdisciplinary practice moves between drawing, performance, and video to address the cultural suppression of women's narratives and the legacy of hysteria. Her work has been shown at venues including Elephant in Los Angeles, Woman Made Gallery in Chicago, Lace in Los Angeles, Goliath Visual Space in Brooklyn, Paul Robeson Gallery at Rutgers, Art Gallery in Chicago, Transformer in Washington, D.C., Interaction Fora in Sardinia, Italy, the Archaeological Museum in Bulgaria, and the Ma d'Oeuvre in France. I hope I pronounced that right. I practiced. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Michelle and Cindy.
Okay, I am going to share my screen. Always interesting. Make sure it works. Okay, you see a house? See a house. Okay, great, perfect. So thank you all for coming today. What I'm going to do in the first part of this talk is just outline the journey of discovery, research, and experimentation that led to the body of work that's currently in the gallery, including like false starts and diversions, as well as talk a little bit about the process itself that I used to make the final images. So starting at the very beginning, I was born into a military family, and we moved around a lot. And I'm mentioning this because this project is in large part about family history and home. And that moving around was kind of a formative experience for me. It means that where I'm from or where I think of home is a difficult question to answer. It's sort of fluid and it depends on circumstances. I've always loved houses of all kinds, small or large, quiet or full of life. My desire to study architecture grew out of that interest. And I've accumulated family histories of all the homes we've had, including this little sod house from my grandmother's childhood in South Dakota. My own experience of home as a structure anyway is granted in suburban North America. This is an aerial view of the neighborhood that I lived in Mesa in the late 1970s, which is full of those classic ranch houses from the 70s. And I had what I would consider kind of an ordinary childhood, but because we moved so often, I didn't have a whole lot of contact with my extended family. And so as a result, our little nuclear family of 4 was very close, and we made our own home wherever we went. But then as I grew older, I started to accumulate stories, secrets essentially, stories of loss or trauma, scandals or crimes committed from my family and within my circle of friends. And each of these secrets revealed would cause a fundamental shift in my or my friends' conception of what it means to be home or at home, introducing a sort of core conflict that's hard to reconcile. How do you come to terms with both love and horror at the same time? Old memories now exist in opposition to new knowledge, and we can't unlearn the secret. So I began a project that was dealing with the idea of home and facades and what can be hidden or concealed within. I was tearing photographs of houses apart and trying to use images of trees interspersed with the structure to refer to the wildness inside. But the sewing and the layers, the quilt forms, and the yummy sepia tones were all lending an air of nostalgia and sentimentality to the work that was the wrong kind of nostalgia. So rather than subverting it, I was evoking it. And I was much more interested in the conflicted condition that a person can be both homesick and sick of home at the same time. I was looking a lot at the work of artists like Rachel Whiteread and Doris Salcedo and Mona Hatoum. They're all dealing with issues of domesticity and absence and trauma in a stripped down, unsentimental way. And as this is a deeply personal project, I was also curious about how an artist like Salcedo would address trauma, but obliquely. She was making work that was inspired by stories of violence and trauma experienced by victims of war in Colombia. And in response was creating those kind of dysfunctional, petrified, entombed furniture objects. In my own work, I wasn't interested in illustrating specific stories, but in developing in the work the kind of intellectual uncertainty that comes out of the uncanny. The sense that something is wrong, that the familiar has become unfamiliar. And I appreciated the clarity in these pieces, the idea of like the single potent gesture. So I also tried to pare down my process to the simplest gesture that I thought could get to the heart of the issue. My artistic preferences up to this point had been tied to the physical, sensual nature of materials and textures. So working in this more graphic, minimal way was challenging for me. And I had to kind of kill off some of my darlings to consider a way forward. I began by simply removing or voiding the houses from their environment, or painstakingly marking out the house with graphite. Thinking about the difference between negating or removing something versus covering something over. I also created some digital composites, merging voided out snapshots of LA area homes with forests for my travels into these, slightly spooky fairy tale scenes. And where this is successful to me, or at least kind of interesting, is in some of the visual conflicts introduced by the composite. Like the shadow direction of the tree across the road doesn't match the light direction. But these still felt maybe too fairy tale-like. And in a fairy tale world, anything is possible, so it can't really be uncanny. The uncanny occurs more in the murky middle that exists when a phenomenon that's grounded in the real remains unexplained. It's like being lost in a place that you actually know really well, or when a word that you use all the time suddenly looks like it's spelled wrong. This happens to me a lot. As David Krell put it in an essay he wrote for research and phenomenology, the uncanny will be, in fact, the most familiar. It will be the skeleton in the closet of every home, of the most closely closeted closet in the homiest home there ever was. And while it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek comment, I think the idea that the uncanny resides at home or in a domestic space was really interesting. So CG is really it's a good place to explore the uncanny. If you've heard the term uncanny valley, that one refers more directly to characters, but it's the idea that as a computer graphics element approaches but does not quite achieve perfect realism, it becomes increasingly unappealing and disturbing. So I leveraged some of my skills from computer graphics to build these 3D models of those same like little California bungalows and then situate them in an environment. And I rendered them using software that would almost negate all of the light responses if they're absorbing most of the light in the environment. And they sit somewhere between a void and a presence, I think. And because they're situated in the photograph, they have some credibility while still remaining ambiguous. 3D rendering is trickery. It's a hack, to convince the computer and the viewer that the object is real or material, that it's present, or that it has volume when it really does not. And for this piece in particular, it was interesting to me that something as transparent as this glass house could still, I guess, be opaque in a way. It still doesn't reveal what's inside. I didn't think the structures alone were a complete thought, and I wanted to maybe get inside those spaces in a way using domestic furniture as proxies for bodies. So if you wandered into one of those weird houses, what might you find? These little projects were in my mind like virtual sculpture. I was thinking back like to Mona Hatoum's cheese grater bench, some sort of dysfunctional object, but I wasn't entirely satisfied with the gallery-like presentation. So just putting these things in a white void. And I thought they needed to be in an environment. I spent a week out in the California desert around Death Valley, gathering photographic settings for my objects. Some of the settings were quite remote, required some fun four-wheel driving to get to. But I wanted to go to places where I could be sure there were no other like human structures or evidence of, like power lines and things. I wanted to get out there, like this sort of mythical desert landscape. And I was curious to see whether I could start to build really spare narratives with the objects in the desert. For me, the desert is like a personal internalized landscape. It's the landscape of certain central years of my growing up in the Southwest. But it's also, I think, a space of arrested time, or at least like a different scale of time. Things grow and change really slowly in the desert. It's gigantic and expansive, and as opposed to the closed, intimate nature of the woods, the wooded scenes I was making earlier. Trying to build some contrast or tension between the objects and its inhabited space. I also played around with the idea of making actual physical things that I would then, making them in the studio and dragging them out with me to locations to photograph. I quickly realized there were limitations to this, just practical and physical ones. And I wanted to be able to make, sort of bigger or more complex objects than just the thing that I could fit in my truck or that one or two people could carry. And I started thinking about dollhouses. Dollhouses, as we usually experience them, are houses within houses. So they're small things within our larger dwelling. So they're both inside and outside, which is interesting. They're small, but they carry a lot of meaning. They're where children play out and practice domestic roles of life. They are typically aspirational, I think. And so I wanted to see what I could do with that, to turn it on its head, so to speak. and I tried building miniatures and photographing them in the environment. The problem though with these like shot on location was the depth of field issues that came up. So the blur and the obvious visual cues give away that the objects are miniature. It gives away their scale and their origin, and they look too much like what they were, like an abandoned childhood object. And those weren't quite the right associations I was looking for. So I continued to make more of them because I really wanted to solve this problem. And I used vintage kits from the 70s to build some of them. And some of them I built from scratch, or I made like mini-me versions of the full-scale objects I had already been working with. And then I photographed them separately outside in places near my studio or my home, but in similar lighting conditions to the desert landscape. Trying to match time of day and sun angle and perspective to the background plate. And then I used just Photoshop tricks and other compositing tricks to make them look as if they belonged there. Scaling up, for me, scaling up like an identifiably miniature object to human size and then putting it in this crazy big landscape was a way for me to explore that kind of condition of being in simultaneous but conflicting states. I took advantage of existing sky and ground bounce lighting. I put these little objects on cardboard so I could capture the shadows. I really didn't care about the rest of the background because I was going to pull that out later in Photoshop. But doing it this way solved some issues of integration for me, actually pretty handily. And this structure uses found dollhouse windows, doors, and chimney. And the box itself is covered in encaustic wax. And that's where it lives now. And I'll say that the compositing work is not perfect. It's wasn't intended to be. Thinking back to that house in the woods, I like the idea that there could be a first and a second read. So that, at first glance, you might think, well, that's some kind of weird little shack out there, but upon inspection, the image starts to feel less and less right. And it might irritate or poke at your brain as you try to resolve some visual conflict, some wrongness in the image. I plan the narrative to move from the outside through increasingly open structures to a space where the walls have fallen away entirely. And I experimented with composition and locations, as well as increasingly interfering with the objects themselves to make them carry a little more narrative weight and to make them unique. Chairs in particular reference the human body in such an intimate way. They're something that we touch or that holds us. And they were some of my favorite forms. Not using actual humans was important to me. It's part of that distancing or disassociative process of looking at trauma from askance. And I used this pair as a stand-in to represent a specific conversation in my past. The immateriality of CG was something I kept returning to, thinking about. And so in this case, a physical miniature in one frame has its own digital doppelganger in another. It's a way of doubling that I think was also important to the story being told here. And it's another play on the idea of absence and presence. My digital studio is a really different workspace than my physical studio, and computer graphics is just a strange, disembodied practice. It's something that I always struggle with. There's an offset between the gestures of the hands and the effect of that gesture on the screen that we're all kind of used to, probably those of us who work digitally a lot, but it's still not satisfying in the way that making analog work is, I think. To make an image such as this, I first need to obtain or build a 3D model. And 3D models don't inherently have any materiality. They're smooth and featureless. So textures and color added in a 3D paint package. And then in this case, I used a procedural geometry tool to instance the chairs across a flat plane and then randomize their positions and orientation. I set up lights in the scene to match time of day, and it matched the camera lens as best I could, and then render out an image of just the chairs and another one of just the shadows to make the compositing look easier. And this is a ground plane that's just an approximation of what I think is happening in the photo, but it's flat. I didn't get too fancy with it. And then here we have the finished image. This is the only piece in the show like this with so many multiples. But in this moment, I was thinking specifically about how our digital identity proliferates on the internet and how difficult it can be to erase unwanted information. So secrets that get revealed on the internet just keep popping up over and over, like a repressed memory. They can haunt you forever. And then at the same time, I was thinking about how the technology used in making digital work is very frangible. It's ephemeral. It's more challenging to conservation than work made on newsprint. Because the technology keeps moving forward, it's a one-way trip. And it's been, I think, 2.5 years now since I made this image, but there's no way I could make it again. I can't go back and re-render it. Software changes and dependencies change and the files degrade and you know, there's data rot, that kind of thing. So the digital is weirdly both eternal and temporary. So I, you know, in the whole body of work, I could just continue to kind of skitter around the topics at hand. I'm still convinced that illustrating a trauma too explicitly is, at least for this story, is too directive and maybe too sensational or invasive or sentimental. So there's an intentional coolness or detachment to the work. I think I'm still not interested in revealing all my secrets. But they do contain personal stories referenced through these objects that come directly from my own life in a way that perhaps provide clues or opportunities for association. So, you know, it's not important necessarily that viewers know this is a replica of my childhood dresser, but the specificity of it hopefully does provide a connection point. All right. And then I'm just going to page through some images of the current installation as it is now in Keystone. The gallery has two kind of main rooms with this box that's on the left in between. And there's a lot of interesting architectural elements in the gallery space. So I just decided to embrace that and work with them. Kind of playing around with the architecture and the installation. All right. I think that's it. Are we back?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, you know, I think since you just ended with those installation shots, maybe we'll start there actually, since that will be fresh in everyone's mind, especially for those people who maybe haven't seen the show yet. I did think it was really interesting the way the show was installed and the fact that you had some pieces that were more kind of traditionally at eye level, and then you had smaller prints that were either very high or very low on the ground. And then there were also the inclusion of some of the objects that you included that were your subject matter. I'm just wondering if you could talk about some of the decisions that you made or even why you decided to include those sculptural elements in the installation.
Sure, yeah. So the images are all kind of the sizes they are, because partly because they may demand a certain scale. So some of them wanted to be big and some wanted to be small. And then the installation was, I was thinking about two things in the way that they're installed. I was thinking a little bit about narrative and like very loose sentence structures. So there's like a flow to chunks of the work and then like punctuation marks, for lack of a better term, at the end. So an image that's either more dimensional or framed or an object, like at the end of a sort of series of thoughts. And then the other thing that I was thinking a lot about in terms of the placement was just engaging the viewer in a way that they have to move their body to see the work, that you have to squat down to get close to some tiny things that are posted low, or you have to kind of stretch and reach to see something that's up high. And you know, someone commented to me that it made them feel miniature, which I thought was really great. That it can take you back to sort of an age which you weren't tall enough to see everything, or where things you experience things low to the ground. So that was also stuff I was thinking about. And then the objects. So the objects are new, I think, in terms of including them with the prints. I think originally I had decided that the project was just about the prints, and I didn't want to tip my hand, I guess. Like I didn't want to necessarily give away the process. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought that actually didn't matter, that the process is part of the content, to the point where I didn't really want people to understand what I was doing. Mm-hmm. And so the objects are included are all miniatures of different scales that I've made. None of them appear in the photos themselves, so they are their own thing, but I think they are reference or, siblings of the objects that are in the photos.
Yeah, they definitely feel related. And I think too, seeing the sculptural forms, you really understand the tactile part of it, like what those surfaces look like, and you may understand how they're made, or you might become more curious how they're made. So I think they're just more tangible in some ways, seeing those pieces. And I definitely had that experience of moving around the space, and I was thinking about that, like that I couldn't just have this kind of static looking around. I physically had to move through the space. So I think that was definitely very effective. You had mentioned some of the pieces you showed towards the beginning, some of your earlier work, this idea of nostalgia. And you said like these ones had the wrong kind of nostalgia. And I'm assuming you mean like they were like a sentimentality. So I'm wondering, what is the right kind of nostalgia? If you could talk a little bit more about that, like what is the kind of nostalgia you're aiming for?
Yeah, so I read a book by Svetlana Boym called I may pronounce that wrong, but it's called The Future of Nostalgia. And so she talks about restorative and reflective nostalgia. And the wrong kind of nostalgia, I guess, is the restorative kind. It's often politically motivated, but it's this desire to go back to the past, this belief that the past was better. It's the kind of nostalgia that's like fueling Make America Great Again. It's the kind of nostalgia that generated all of those monuments in the South that were built in the 1920s to the Confederacy. It's a revisionist history kind of nostalgia. And I think what she describes as reflective nostalgia is the more melancholy cousin. It's the one that's full of longing and a realization and acceptance of the loss, and an acknowledgement that the past is the past as well. So it's not something.
So it's making me think too. I think we've talked about this book in the past, Susan Stewart's On Longing, because I've always been really compelled by her ideas about nostalgia, which is more like nostalgia is a longing for this thing that was never existed in the first place. So that it like can never be fulfilled, it can never be completed. And I think there's something really interesting about that. And I think that can kind of apply to some of the things that are happening in your work too, this kind of absence or the abandoned, or this thing that can, you know, it's almost like really can't be returned to because it was always a fabrication. It was always a projection. So I think that's interesting to think about too, in relation to these pieces. And you have talked you had written a essay recently, and I'm just going to read a short quote from the essay because I thought it was really compelling. You said, all computer graphic objects are ghosts, solid appearing but ephemeral, voids contained within an infinitely thin skin, perfect proxies for my memories. And then in this essay, you also talk about this term called prosthetic memory. Could you talk a little bit about the layers of memory in your work and maybe that term specifically?
Yeah. So prosthetic memory, I think it has a couple of different meanings. It has I guess a cultural meaning. It can refer to our ability to assimilate experiences that are not our own, or that we didn't have, but we sort of claim them as our own, if that makes sense. And you know, this can be good or bad. It can be empathy generating for sure. But it, you know, in this work, I was thinking, at least in part, about the role of the witness, of being adjacent to trauma, so affected, but in a different way than a victim. So I think this interpretation of prosthetic memory could apply. But I had also come across it in an essay by this guy named Pierre Nora. And in the essay is called Realms of Memory. He describes prosthetic memory as the overlay of the recorded moment, i.e. like the family photograph, with our perception or memory of the moment, which then forever changes the experience. And I think Sally Mann also talks about this, but the idea is that each time we look at the record of the moment, the record increasingly becomes what we remember rather than the moment itself. And so the photo becomes the truth, you know, regardless of what was actually happening in the moment. And you know, so one of the core ideas of the project is the way in which memories shift over time, and with each, you know, new examination of the memory, but also with each new bit of knowledge that you might gain, or from a, let's say, a story or whatever, those memories will change and they become contaminated or shifts their meaning. And I think prosthetic memory might also connect back to nostalgia. I think it you know, in terms of like the family photo album, I think it enables a kind of nostalgia. Everyone's always smiling in the family photos, right? And that's not necessarily how it always was. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting thinking about the role, especially in families, right, of the static image, and you know what it captures, and then also how we read it and how it might block, you know, actual memories that we have, that the photo becomes the stand-in for the actual memory, and you know, starts to shape narrative. And it does seem like so there is such a layering of narrative ideas in your work. I wanted to talk about a little bit about just the use of the dollhouse and the dollhouse furniture. And I wasn't really thinking about it till we were just talking, even thinking about like in therapy and trauma, a lot of times dolls are used like as a vehicle. And, you know, thinking about obviously dollhouses as a, you know, something that a child would play with, although I think they were originally for adults. And it was more about, you know, this idea of projecting yourself into this space. And these spaces that you're creating are, you know, they're dark, or they're abandoned, or a little bit creepy. And so I'm wondering what you think about, you know, the relationship of the viewer's body projection into that space. Is it something, I don't know if people have even talked to you about that, their reactions to these spaces, because you are kind of creating this fantasy environment that someone could potentially walk into?
Yeah, like I thought a lot about how I wanted people to engage. So I guess from, you know, I am the kind of person that's always drawn to these sorts of things. I like creepy empty houses and abandoned stuff. I will go rummage through, you know, I'll stop on the side of the road and run over across the field to some empty shed to rummage just to see what's in there. Because I like the mystery. So I'm drawn to those kinds of things. I think I like building stories around, in my mind, about scenarios that I think may have happened. So I'm trying, you know, some degree creating that experience here. And I thought a lot about, I mean, this is tangential maybe, but I thought about where I was placing these moments in time. You know, is it something that is going to happen, or is happening at the moment, or is it already happened? And most of the work is in the already happened. And I think it kind of sits there. There are a few sequences that are a little more in the moment, like the burning chair conversation. But I mean, you know, hopefully when you think about it, and maybe this is a gendered, this might be a gendered thing, because I don't know how many men grew up playing with dollhouses, but they're, the fact that they're there and they're sort of set up in this way, I think it's interesting to try and evoke that idea of manipulating a reality and trying to gain control over reality, because you are in control of what happens in the dollhouse. If that makes sense.
Well, it's interesting too, like you were just talking about finding abandoned spaces. Like when you enter an abandoned space, you're inventing or creating a narrative over, there's no other body there, but you're creating narratives that have bodies, right? And so all of these objects that says that there's some kind of human element, but sort of like since there's no human element there, we're kind of making up the stories that those people would have had in those spaces or in relation to those objects. So I think that's really interesting. Like there is a way that the viewer can project into those spaces, and it might be not as innocent as like a dollhouse might be. Although I actually too, I think children, sometimes the things you invent in dollhouses, sometimes, you know, Barbie is murdering Ken or whatever it may be, you know, there's definitely, it's not always a sweet scenario. So maybe we're being a little too sentimental about what children do in their dollhouses anyway. My next question, you know, is sort of related to this, is this idea of invented spaces. And certainly like in the history of dream analysis, you know, people dreaming about being in a house you had been in when you were a child, or being inside a room. I'm just wondering if like psychology, dream analysis, surrealism, if that comes into play in this project.
Definitely psychology. I dove right into Freud. I kind of had to. I felt like if I was going to talk about the uncanny, and I found, you know, I have lots of thoughts about Freud, but I did find his definition of the uncanny to be useful in this context. He actually breaks down the German term unheimlich specifically as being in opposition to the term Heimlich, which in the vernacular of the time period meant like homey and cozy, but it also meant private and secret. And so the unheimlich also, and familiar and all of those things, but the term unheimlich or uncanny, you know, as we translate uncanny in the German, kind of means not only the unfamiliar, but it also means like a secret revealed. And that was a real catalyst for me kind of traveling down that path of using the uncanny to talk about secrets. And you know, that essay was written in or published in 1919, I think, which is right when the surrealists were heavily active. And as a group, I think they were definitely working within psychological spaces and I think playing around with the uncanny. And so, you know, like Merritt Oppenheim's Breakfast in Fur comes to mind, like the fur-covered teacup. And Man Ray's Le Cadeau. It's the iron with the spikes on it. It's like very threatening, and you know, it's like a domestic object.
Right, and so that is very much within that conversation of the domestic becoming like something terrifying.
Yeah. I think dream analysis, it's funny, that's one thing that I didn't, at least in terms of research, pursue, and now I feel like, oh, that's a thread I should have pulled.
I think actually, because I've been thinking, as you know, I'm working on a project related to Woman House, and so I was thinking about the structure of the house and kind of came across you know, just how prevalent it is for people to dream about how houses or rooms. And it made me start to realize I've done that, you know, like remembering, like dreaming that you're in your grandmother's house that you haven't been in, you know, since you were 5 years old or whatever. So I think it's interesting thinking about, and I think it can, like can definitely have that experience in a dream where it is this very chilling, uncanny sensation to like be somewhere where you know you've been before, or sometimes it like just seems like it's that place. It's even though it's a completely invented space. So I think there's a lot of material to tap into, just thinking about the ways that our brains invent spaces, you know, in this kind of more dreamlike state. I just want to switch to something slightly different now. Like, and you touched on this in your talk, talking about you kind of you're moving between more analog processes in photography and referencing even the history of photography. I know that kind of comes into your thinking about your work a lot, and then using the digital, and then also these very, very tactile, like using encaustic or, you know, building little sculptural. And just, could you talk a little bit about that movement back and forth between the analog and the very handmade and the very digital?
Yeah. How do I want to tackle this? And in some respects, they're kind of both used towards the same goal, to play with perception of scale. And the, you know, the CG objects, they have no inherent scale. They can be any scale.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually was working with them that partially gave me the idea to try building the miniatures, but scale them up. So again, to support that scale. And all the images are pretty heavily digitally manipulated in the end, the images at least. So they're all mediated. From a practical standpoint, it was easier to experiment with the miniatures.
Mm-hmm.
Or I chose the process based on what I was trying to do. Like I could build a glass house on the computer really easily, but I can't do it physically, or at least I don't.
Mm-hmm.
But experimenting with stuff just with the hand was more, kind of let me play a little bit more intuitively, because the computer requires so much planning, and it's very unfriendly to that kind of experimentation. So going back and forth was helpful.
I mean, it seems like it's been an ongoing aspect of your work, right? I can't imagine you being someone that goes entirely digital, right? That you kind of need this, like, you know, like the tactile. And I think it's interesting too to think about, you know, it allows you to experiment, but I always find like when you're physically working with something, it opens a different part of your brain that I think is much harder to access when you're doing digital stuff. So I think that's interesting too, thinking about how you're, you know, how you're thinking or how your mind is responding when you're using these very different kinds of process. And I think too, it's like, you know, I think in the digital, the labor is often hidden, right? That, you know, it might be hours and hours and hours to render one small part. So I think it's interesting having the part that's very physical and then the part that's very kind of digital. And for me, it becomes abstract because I don't make work like that. I know it's very labor intensive. So I think it's interesting to have that kind of shift back and forth. You mentioned a few times different things, different writings or text that were part of this project or that inspired this project. And I know reading is really important to you. Are there any other like books or texts that kind of you were consuming during this time that became important in the project?
Well, definitely on longing. You were the one that introduced me to that. And I think I read it twice. Certainly parts of it I read through twice, because, you know, it's not just how she speaks about nostalgia, but she also talks about the gigantic and the miniature. Those two different sort of scales. She had a chapter on the souvenir that I find really interesting, and where she talks about the way we pack an entire experience into like a little object that we try to take home that sort of tries to represent a whole, you know, whole range of experiences. Quite interesting. I was reading about the uncanny. I read Vidler's Architectural Uncanny. I read writings by Hito Steyerl. Yeah, because she was writing about
She's more about like technology
technology and
digital
yeah,
and yeah, and kind of creating environments. Like her work is really interesting, and also I find her work has a big political component to it also, like bringing that into art making.
yeah.
Well, I mean, I'd like to have some time for people to ask questions, but I just wanted to ask one last question. And you've told me a little bit about what you're working on now. So if you could just talk a little bit about that. I know you're still thinking about the house as a structure, but this is kind of becoming even, I think it's interesting. It's becoming even more a dialogue between the digital and the handmade.
Yeah, I am currently, I guess you'd say it's collaborating with an AI and a web-based AI. And what I've done is submitted a data set of images. I don't know if you're familiar with machine learning and those AI training and stuff like that. There's been a lot in the news where you see these crazy faces of humans and they look real, but they're completely made up. So my hypothesis or my question was, can I do the same thing with images of houses, and can I get brand new houses that never existed back from this AI that would be, you know, and what would it decide were the important features of a house? Would it have windows and doors? I don't really know. And what I got back was profoundly weird. It wasn't entirely what I was expecting. But the forms are really interesting and full of errors and glitches. And when I looked at them, I was thinking about translation and this idea of translating something without knowing the language, essentially. The computer is trying to learn the language while it's trying to translate at the same time. And so what you get is really weird. And I decided that I wanted to try and translate those back into something that's analog. And so I'm making stitched pieces or embroideries that recreate these AI homes, but in a really kind of, I don't know, almost twee fashion. You know, using cross stitch, like referencing the old home sweet home samplers. Like that.
It's interesting. It's like kind of the opposite of what you're doing with the last project, right? Like taking the handmade into the digital. Now you're taking the digital and kind of bringing it back into this. And, you know, and there's a different speed and labor in making a cross stitch than you would have in other kinds of forms. So I think that's really interesting. And I look forward to seeing that body of work. Okay, great. So like someone has just, if anyone has any questions that you'd like to put in the chat, someone had just written, could you list some of the books that you read for the project? I remember Gaston Bachelard and Pierre Nora.
Yeah, should I type?
Yeah, why don't you put them in the chat if that way people would have reference to them.
Poetics of Space. Everyone who went to architecture school probably read that. And I think the realms of memory I found in the Whitechapel book called Memory. You know, there's that whole series of Whitechapel books on critical theory and arts that have like single word titles like ruins and nostalgia or something. Yeah, so that might have come from there. On longing for sure. I'll add more as I think of them. I have a whole bibliography, so if anyone wants to just reach out over Instagram or email or whatever, I'll put my email in here.
I wish that happened more actually, that we included our bibliographies with exhibitions, because I personally, it's really important to me. And actually, that's the one thing I love about Instagram. Actually, I follow a bunch of people who are readers and I find books that way. So it's like, it's great if you can see what other people are reading. It can be really, I love that. I love that thread of seeing what text influenced a body of work.
Yeah, for sure.
Does anybody else have any questions or any comments for Michelle? Yeah, Phil.
Hi, my name is Phil Laurie. I'm in San Luis Obispo. Thank you. Really wonderful presentation. And very thorough. I really appreciate the way you described, connected all the dots in your workflow and your process. I had a couple of things. your sense of scale, taking small things and putting them in the desert, I think that's fascinating. Are you familiar with a painting by Rheem called Personal Values? Well, when you're done today, when you have some time, I would recommend two paintings of his for you to think about. I think you're kind of in the same world in some ways. The painting, Personal Values, it's a bedroom scene basically, and everything's way bigger than it should be. The bed's normal, the windows are normal, but the soap, he's showing a soap bar and I think a shaving thing, and they're all gigantic. They're like 6 feet tall or fill the room up.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting concept. And being surrealism has to do with conflict. In his case, he really illustrated conflict of scale really well to drive home the whole idea of mystery, that something can't be explained. And when I was a little kid, I remember going to see another piece of his called Time Transfixed at the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's still there, the original. And it's I think you've probably seen this. It's it's in his patron's house where he was staying, Henry James. It's his fireplace, but there's a train engine coming out, a steam engine, a full-scale train engine coming out. But in comparison to the mantle on the fireplace, it looks like a model, but it looks real. And so you have to sort of say, what's real? Is it a scaled up fireplace, or is it a scaled down train? And there are other interesting elements of conflict as well, because there are two candles on the ledge of the mantle above the fireplace with a mirror behind them. And one candle you can see a reflection, and the other you cannot. Which, there's a lot of little things like that in his work. So I think your idea of scale enters into surrealism in some ways, touches on that. So when you were describing the experimentation, when taking out something small and putting it in the desert at first, and you discovered the problem with the focus and the depth of field, a lot of people love that. And they actually made a lens for that. It's called a tilt shift.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with tilt shift lens? I would think it would be an interesting possibility if you did a tilt shift, and you can do that with the camera, with the lens, or you can do it in post-production too. There's a number of techniques. If you Google it, you can find it. And some actually, so like my Vegas actually has an effect called tilt shift. We'll do it automatically, so you can just one step. But the problem, the point is, if you did a side by side, you made a real size object or bigger than real size, whatever, and you put it in the same place and photographed it. And then you took a miniature and did the same thing, but then either in post-process or with the camera tilt shift, and did, compare the two. I think it would be very interesting to see how that works. And one's real with tilt shift, and the other is conjured up without it. So anyways, thank you again so much. Really appreciate your work.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, tilt shifts are fun at making real sized things look small. And they're magic.
Anyone else have anything they would like to ask or share? Well, we're really close to 3 o'clock, so we could go ahead and wrap up if that sounds good to you guys.
I might have a question. I'm very inspired by your work. I love surrealism, magnetism. Yeah. Anyway, the question is, what's the difference between the representation of the house transparent, the transparent house and opaque houses. So you have transparency and opacity. Is it, can you say something about that?
Yeah, so in the way that the exhibit's kind of structured, the transparent house is the last image. So it's at the end. And it's a little bit, I mean, it's kind of hokey, but it's a little bit of like, there's nothing left. It's all there, but it's not there. If that makes, it's all open, but it's still not there. I think it was the idea. It's hard to articulate. There are some objects in there's an object in the space that's a house form that has no windows, no doors, no nothing. It's a completely, there's no point of entry. So the glass house at the end is sort of like, I mean, there's obviously the cultural people who live in glass houses should not throw stones kind of, what is that? Can't think of the word for that, but the saying, whatever the saying is. So there's a little bit of that in there, but there's also just this intention that that while everything might be exposed, you still don't entirely know what's contained. And there's also a fragility to the glass that doesn't exist in the other images that I think is important, like a vulnerability to being not exposed.
I was just wondering if there would be a difference between an opaque dream and a transparent dream. I'm thinking about the way you represented the house, with the black, and then you only have the silhouette. You have no idea what, there are windows, there's opening, nothing, and the other one is all about openings. So just wondering.
Yeah, I actually played around with the idea of having something recognizable inside that house, and some of the early versions of the open transparent house did. It was like occupied. And then I backed away from that again because it felt like it was giving away too much. So I left it where it was, where you see the environment through and reflected in, but in a way it's still kind of opaque.
Well, thank you.
I think it's 3.
Okay.
Oh. Yeah, if you guys want to wrap it up.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go to gallery view because I just want to see everybody. Oh, there we go. Hello. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Oops. Sorry. You'd think I don't use Zoom very often. Let me see. Oh, there we go. Wrong one. Remove spotlight. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I think everybody, if you go into gallery view, you should be able to see each other. But no, this was such a fantastic talk. I mean, I wrote down, just really fast, a wrap up some of the things that I personally can be both homesick and sick of home at the same time. Oh my gosh, that like spoke to me. Definitely. And, the idea of, there being something between the void and the presence. And also I grew up in the desert in the Antelope Valley. And so the idea that this personal internalized landscape, I can totally relate to that too. So, and also killing off your darlings. I do that a lot in my art. So no, so many gems. It's so great to hear about the process of your career. I mean, of your art, of your practice, of, kind of where you started and where you are now, and looking forward to seeing where that goes. So thank you both so much. Such a great conversation.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, on a Tuesday afternoon or
Yeah.
enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for your courage.
Thank you.
I don't know where my comment went. I'm sorry. I kept dropping in and out. But
Oh,
I really appreciate your vulnerability and your courage and sharing all of that. And the comment that I had said was that the desert seemed to me like it was letting things air out and giving space to breathe. And I really liked that.
oh,
So
that's
it's
great.
very moving. And I'm going to have to catch the first 20 minutes. So I was in the middle of making apple crisp and I said, oh, it's 5:20. I want to hear Michelle.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
There are quite a few comments, so if you want to save chat to be able to go back, do you know how to do that?
Oh, yeah. I think I did.
I don't know how many chats I have on my computer.
Great. Yeah, I saved it. Awesome.